Ethan was used to feeling invisible. He walked down the school corridors each day with his head lowered, quietly dodging the jeers and elbow jabs of other students. His clothes were usually too big and mismatched, found at discount stores or passed down from distant cousins. He never quite managed to comb his hair in a way that fit in, and he didn't have a slew of friends to fill his lunch period with chatter. Home wasn't particularly comforting either. It wasn't that his mother and father were unloving, but they worked long hours, often leaving Ethan alone to figure out how to handle the small dramas of adolescence by himself. He spent most afternoons in his room, sketching cartoons in a spiral notebook and daydreaming about the fantasy worlds he wished he could escape to. His classmates barely noticed him, except when they needed a target for their teasing. But in truth, Ethan had a depth of compassion hidden behind his wary gaze. He just wasn't sure where to direct it, or if anyone would trust him enough to let him show it. One evening, when the clouds were gathering overhead and the streetlights flickered on, Ethan was trudging along the sidewalk toward home. He'd stayed after school to avoid an argument some older boys were having about him in the lunchroom. He thought if he waited long enough, they might just forget about him altogether. The city's concrete appeared to reflect his own dull, worn soul. He kicked a soda can as he passed a small, run-down alley adjacent to a row of abandoned buildings. Something seemed off in his peripheral vision, a fleeting movement behind a rusted trash bin. Ethan paused, squinting in the fading light. He almost shrugged it off and continued walking, but a barely audible mewing noise caught his ear. He tilted his head toward the sound, curiosity overpowering the instinct to hurry home. Wrinkling his nose at an unpleasant smell drifting from the stuffed garbage bags, he took a tentative step forward. The mew grew more distinct, a plaintive, tremulous call. Then he saw a tiny ball of fur, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, shivering behind the bins. Gently, he crouched down to get a better look. The kitten, thin and dirty, peered up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Its coat was mottled gray with small patches of white. One of its ears had a slight tear, as if it had already encountered more of the harshness of life than any creature so young should. Ethan's heart twisted in his chest. He never felt truly needed or wanted in his everyday world. But this kitten obviously had no one at all. His mouth went dry as he realized that turning away and leaving it there would be unthinkable. Yet, he didn't know how to care for a kitten. He'd never even had a pet. With uncertain fingers, he reached out, trying to see if it would let him approach without running off. The kitten flinched, then stumbled, nearly too weak to put up a fight. Gently, Ethan scooped it into his arms, feeling its tiny ribs beneath his fingers. His mind raced. Even if he brought it home, he couldn't imagine his parents, already exhausted and stressed, welcoming a stray animal. His father worked 2 jobs, barely making enough to support their modest apartment, and his mother had just switched to a night shift at the local grocery store. They hardly had time for themselves, let alone a kitten. Still, as he looked into the animal's frightened face, he knew he couldn't leave it out on the cold streets. He needed another plan. He cradled the kitten in the crook of his arm, glancing around for someone to tell, but nobody was there. The wind whipped around the corner, carrying a faint echo of distant traffic. Figures crossed the intersection far ahead, but no one turned in his direction. With a resigned sigh, Ethan began walking toward the dilapidated shed he had discovered weeks earlier, behind one of the abandoned houses on his route home. The peeling paint and missing shingles had scared him off at first, but later it had become a place to hide from the taunts he endured at school. It wasn't locked, and it felt like a secret space he could claim for himself. Now, perhaps it could become a shelter for both him and the kitten, a place where no one would judge them or bully them for being small and powerless. When he reached the old wooden door, he gently nudged it open, or faint. Creak reverberated through the empty lot. The interior was dim and musty, filled with piles of discarded boxes, old gardening tools, and loose nails scattered across the floor. Carefully, Ethan found a corner behind a stack of crates where a little light from a cracked window reached. He set the kitten on a worn blanket he'd found there earlier, checked for spiders and sharp objects, and brushed away dust to make it somewhat comfortable. The kitten mewed pitifully, stepping uncertainly on spindly legs. Ethan's chest tightened at how fragile the creature looked. He whispered, "You'll be safe here. I promise." He extended his hand, and the kitten nudged its tiny nose against his fingers, settling into a trembling purr. Ethan smiled, realizing that even though its purr was quiet, it was proof that somewhere inside it, hope still flickered. He spent a few minutes stroking the kitten's fur, ignoring the filth that clung to his fingertips. In that silent exchange, something stirred within him, a growing resolve that he had to protect this small life, no matter the obstacles. That night, Ethan crept home, heart pounding with fear that someone would discover his secret. He hastily ate his dinner, answered his parents' usual questions in monotone, then retreated to his bedroom. But sleep did not come. His mind buzzed with thoughts of the kitten, alone in that dark shed, possibly cold and hungry. He contemplated ways to get food for it. He couldn't simply beg his mother for cat food. She would suspect something was up if he showed sudden interest in a pet he had never mentioned. Plus, they barely had enough money for groceries each week. Still, Ethan remembered seeing stray cats around the neighborhood rummaging in garbage bins, so perhaps the kitten could survive on scraps. But that idea made him feel wretched. The kitten deserved better care than that. He had to figure out a plan. Over the next few days, he stashed bits of meat from home-cooked meals, a strip of chicken here, some small cubes of beef there, careful not to raise suspicion. He snuck out early in the mornings, claiming he wanted to get extra reading time at school. In reality, he hurried to the shed to feed the kitten. Wide-eyed and still skittish, it greeted him with a mewl of gratitude. He noticed the animal's health improving. The trembling subsided, and it started to move about with more confidence, exploring the corners of the shed and batting at loose bits of string Ethan found in the junk pile. He even brought an old tennis ball from home for it to play with, though the kitten could do little more than paw at the giant orb. Though the boy had always felt overshadowed by others, he now found himself glowing with a renewed sense of purpose every time he stepped into that musty shed. His tender care was making a real difference. He named the kitten Simba, reasoning that a strong name might help the helpless creature channel some courage. It seemed fitting, a small lion in a big, daunting world. Each new day, the kitten would look healthier, its coat fluffier, and its eyes brighter. The bond they forged was more than one of caretaker and pet. It was a mutual rescue. Ethan saved Simba from a life on the streets, but Simba saved Ethan from the crushing loneliness that had followed him for years. The hidden routine continued for weeks. Ethan was careful to keep anyone from noticing that he lingered behind after school or left the apartment extra early. At school, he didn't have many friends, so there wasn't a risk that someone would tag along uninvited to discover his secret. However, the bullying persisted. One afternoon, a bigger boy named Ryan sneered at him outside the cafeteria, calling him weird, and rummaging through Ethan's backpack as though searching for something to mock. All Ethan could think was, "Please don't find the leftover chicken strips I packed for Simba." He held his breath as Ryan flung out a couple of notebooks and some pencils, rummaging through the rest. Then, apparently bored, Ryan tossed the bag back at Ethan. Relieved, Ethan scrambled to collect his things, but something changed that day. When he hurried to the shed afterward, tears threatening to escape from his eyes, Simba greeted him with a gentle head bump against his shoe, as if to say, "You're not alone." Ethan scooped Simba into his arms and held him. The kitten's purr vibrated like a small engine running on love alone. Suddenly, the sting of Ryan's cruelty felt less potent. For the first time in a while, Ethan realized that no matter how harsh people were outside, there was a being in his life who appreciated him unconditionally. However, the pressure of maintaining his secret grew. Ethan's father was starting to notice his stealthy behavior. Once, Ethan had left the apartment for school earlier than usual, only to find his father already in the kitchen, sipping lukewarm coffee. His father raised an eyebrow. "Where are you off to so early?" he asked. Ethan panicked, stumbling through a half-baked excuse about a group project. His father merely shrugged and went back to reading the paper, but there was scrutiny in his eyes that made Ethan's stomach twist. He couldn't continue this charade forever. Sooner or later, the kitten would be discovered, and he had no idea how his parents would react. One weekend, a fierce autumn storm rolled in, pounding the city with heavy rain. Wind rattled windows and the sky crackled with furious thunder. The night before, Ethan had considered bringing Simba to the apartment, but with his parents still awake, the risk was too high. Instead, he had left an extra blanket in the shed and made sure Simba had a dry spot to hide under an old table. It was Saturday morning now, and the storm still. His parents were glued to the local weather report, worried about flooding on the streets. Ethan's heart pounded. He could only think of Simba, alone in that flimsy shed. The wind might tear off the roof, or water could seep in. What if Simba was trapped or frightened to the point of running away? Unable to stand it, Ethan pulled on his sneakers and jacket, mumbling something about checking on a neighbor's dog that he claimed to be responsible for now and then. His mother, preoccupied, barely glanced up. The father, eyebrows knitted, said, "Be careful out there, it's nasty." Ethan nodded, opening the front door to a blur of gray rain and swirling leaves. He grabbed an umbrella, though the wind nearly whipped it from his hands the moment he stepped outside. Sheets of water drenched his jeans in seconds, but there was no turning back. He clutched the umbrella in one hand and sprinted through puddles, pant cuffs soaked and shoes squelching. When he finally reached the decrepit shed, it looked even more battered than usual. The roof's missing shingles revealed large splinters of wood, a small rivulet of rain streamed beneath the door. Ethan flung it open to find Simba huddled on the highest crate, meowing frantically as water pooled along the shed's floor. He shut the door against the storm, tossed the umbrella aside, and waded over. The kitten leapt into his arms, tiny body trembling. Ethan's heart felt like it might shatter into pieces. Simba was crying, pressing his damp nose into Ethan's jacket. Without hesitating, Ethan pulled off his hoodie and wrapped Simba in its soft fabric, cradling the shivering feline close. The thunder boomed, making the walls rattle. Ethan could see the water creeping higher. If he left the kitten there, it wouldn't be safe. He bit his lip, frantic. He remembered how his parents had always said they were too busy and financially strained to add another mouth to feed. But how could he walk away and leave Simba behind? With a sudden surge of courage, Ethan made a decision. He held the bundled kitten to his chest and dashed out into the rain. The storm pelted him, soaking what little dryness was left in his clothing. He hardly cared. Simba's faint mews of alarm guided him on, as if urging him to run faster. By the time he stumbled back into the apartment building's lobby, he was drenched. The dying overhead light flickered, and the old building supervisor glanced up from his phone but said nothing. Ethan scurried into the stairwell, hoping to avoid the elevator that might contain nosy neighbors. He climbed 2 flights of stairs, panting with exertion. His arms tightened around Simba's trembling body. He could hear the kitten's heartbeat beneath layers of sopping cloth, rapid, but still alive. His fingers shook as he turned the key in his apartment's lock. The door opened, revealing his father standing by the door, with a look of surprise on his face. Before Ethan could say a word, his mother peeked around the corner, eyes drifting down toward the bundle in Ethan's arms. The hush in the room was deafening. Water dripped to the floor, creating shallow puddles beneath Ethan's feet. "What on earth?" His father's voice trailed off. Ethan swallowed hard. There was no more hiding this. Crouching down slightly, he pulled back a corner of the hoodie to reveal Simba's anxious eyes. The kitten let out a small, pitiful mew. In that moment, Ethan thought he might faint from fear and humiliation. He fully expected his parents to scold him, maybe even throw Simba out. But to his astonishment, the anger he expected in his father's expression never came. His mother looked from Ethan to the kitten, her eyes wide. If anything, she seemed more stunned than outraged. "I found him weeks ago," Ethan confessed. "Mom was in an alley. I couldn't just leave him. So I put him in that shed. I looked after him every day. But the storm, he was going to drown or catch pneumonia. I couldn't just let that happen." He paused, realizing he was shaking. "I'm sorry." Next to him, Simba let out another feeble cry, as though begging for mercy. Still silent, Ethan's father extended a hand, inviting Ethan to place the kitten gently in his palms. Ethan complied, trembling, tears threatening to slip down his cheeks. For a few seconds, his father's face remained unreadable as his gaze shifted to the shaking little creature in his hold. Then Ethan's mother stepped forward, carefully resting a hand on her husband's shoulder. Her eyes traveled to meet Ethan's. You've been taking care of him this whole time? Ethan nodded. I had to. He had no one else. A look of slow, dawning understanding passed between his parents. His mother took a breath and ushered Ethan further inside so he could dry off. Why? Why? Didn't you just tell us? She asked softly. Ethan shrugged, throat tight. I didn't think you'd want me to bring home a stray. We're barely getting by ourselves. But I couldn't watch him suffer. The sincerity in his voice was raw and unguarded. His father's shoulders relaxed just slightly. Well, he said quietly, it's true we're stretched thin. Then he looked at Simba, who blinked back with a weak, hopeful gaze. But I've seen the way you've been leaving early and coming home late. I thought something was really wrong at school. I guess I was worried about the bullying, but I had no idea you were handling something like this. He glanced at his wife, who nodded in understanding. A relieved burst of emotion surged in Ethan's chest, and he exhaled shakily. He could barely believe that, in this moment, his parents seemed more concerned for his welfare than angry about the stray. His father handed Simba to Ethan's mother, who carefully cradled the kitten. She reached out and wiped away some of the water from Simba's head, attempting a small smile. Let's get him warm, she said. We can give him a chance. That night, Ethan's parents allowed Simba to stay. They dried him off, gave him a few leftover scraps of fish, and set up a makeshift bed out of old towels in the corner of the living room. Ethan watched in amazement as his parents worked together, never once complaining. It was as though Simba's helpless presence awakened a forgotten warmth in them. When they were finished, his mother turned to Ethan. Proud of you, she whispered, then, seeing tears at the corners of Ethan's eyes, she gently placed a hand on his cheek. You have such a big heart. Don't ever be ashamed of that. Things did not become perfectly easy overnight. Money was still tight, and the family had to juggle expenses now that cat food and basic veterinary care would be necessary. But they adapted. Over the following weeks, the apartment took on a new energy. Ethan's mother would break from her routine to reach down and pet Simba. His father, exhausted from long shifts, somehow found the energy to tease the kitten with a piece of string. Ethan, for his part, was no longer gloomily hidden away in his bedroom. He spent time in the living room, playing with Simba or helping his father pick up part-time tasks around the neighborhood to earn a few extra dollars. It didn't take long for Simba to grow in strength and confidence. His once scraggly fur began to shine, and he would scamper around the living room, chasing imaginary bugs. Everyone in the family gradually forgot the tension that had once seemed so pervasive. The boy's parents found themselves sharing small moments of affection again, exchanging a quick smile or a gentle pat on the shoulder when feeding Simba together. Meanwhile, at school, though the bullying didn't vanish, Ethan found that he cared less what other people thought. Whenever someone tried to tease him, he'd picture Simba's eyes full of trust and recall the sense of purpose and love the kitten had given him. Over time, the extraordinary effect Simba had on Ethan began to spread in subtle ways. One afternoon, Ryan, the older boy who used to rummage through Ethan's backpack, was hovering around the lockers, complaining loudly about how his stepfather was making his life miserable. Most kids steered clear, not wanting to get drawn into Ryan's drama. Usually, Ethan would have done the same, but a faint nudge of compassion welled up in him. He remembered how alone he had felt before Simba. Summoning courage, he ambled over and quietly asked if Ryan was okay or needed to talk. Ryan looked stunned and muttered something dismissively. Ethan nodded, leaving him be. Yet as he walked away, he wondered if simply reaching out had planted a small seed of empathy. He had learned that caring for another being, even when it was difficult, connected people in unsuspected ways, bridging gaps that might otherwise remain untraversed. On a bright Saturday morning, Ethan woke to Simba curled up at the foot of his bed, purring contentedly. Birds chirped outside, and sunlight infiltrated the corners of his small room, filling it with a gentle warmth. He stretched, yawned, and peeked down at Simba's contented face, thinking back to how bleak and colorless life had felt before that fateful day he found this tiny stray in the alley. Back then, he had resigned himself to what he believed was his role in life, an invisible boy who couldn't quite belong. But this soft, purring creature had allowed him to become a protector, a caregiver. The devotion he'd shown Simba had awakened the compassion within him that was desperate to be shared. In turn, Simba returned that compassion tenfold, reminding Ethan that he was neither alone nor worthless. He slipped out of bed and carried Simba gently to the kitchen, where he found his mother humming to herself and warming milk on the stove. She turned when he entered, her humming faltering only for a second as she greeted him with a tender smile. His father was running his weekend errands, but had left a small note on the table. Don't forget the groceries for our fourth family member, Dad. Over the last few weeks, such small gestures of acknowledgement had become commonplace, and it filled Ethan's heart with a sense of belonging he never thought possible. Even though life wasn't perfect, the emotional distance from his parents had shrunk. Simba might have been just a tiny stray to the eyes of the world, but to Ethan, he was a miracle. As Ethan prepared Simba's breakfast, he took a moment to reflect on how far they'd both come. The kitten, who once cowered in an alley, was now playful, bounding after shoelaces and curiously sniffing every corner of the apartment. And the boy, who once felt friendless and misunderstood, had opened his heart enough to let love in, and found that it was reciprocated. Compassion had formed a bridge from Ethan to his parents, from the family to Simba, and perhaps even from Ethan to some of the classmates whose hardships he had barely noticed before. After breakfast, Ethan gathered his courage and decided to approach his parents about inviting a friend over. He'd never done that before, partly because he didn't really have a close friend, but he remembered the fleeting idea that maybe if he showed Ryan or another lonely classmate some compassion, a real friendship could grow. His parents, momentarily surprised, nodded encouragingly. Even that small permission felt like a victory. While the misfit label still followed Ethan in some ways, he chose not to be defined by it anymore. If he'd learned anything, it was that opening one's heart, even just a crack, could let in an abundance of light. As the morning progressed, Ethan went back to his room to read a book. Simba, having finished his breakfast, strolled in and curled up on Ethan's lap. Absently, Ethan petted the kitten, listening to the soothing rumble of its purr. He remembered how scared he was when he first found Simba. He had worried about providing for him, how his parents would react, and whether he was worthy of caring for another living creature. Yet, in stepping up to help the kitten, he had unearthed his own strength and taught himself that kindness was never wasted. In that sense, he realized compassion was more powerful than any jeer or insult he'd faced at school. It was the universal language that could break down walls no matter how tall. Outside, the sky was fresh and bright, washed clean by the storm. At last, the city streets glimmered with puddles reflecting the sunlight. Ethan thought of the old shed, where he had once hidden from the world, lost in a sense of invisibility. He closed his eyes and whispered gratitude for how everything had changed. The best part was that he could continue to change more in small ways, simply by caring. Simba gave a contented yawn and nestled closer into Ethan's lap, drifting off to a peaceful sleep. Gently, Ethan placed a hand on the kitten's back, feeling the slow rise and fall. It stunned him how a creature so small could hold such a vast place in his life. The kitten had broken him open, exposing all his vulnerabilities and joys, and in return, Ethan felt a renewed sense of belonging, like a door had been opened, a path that led him to realize that he, too, deserved to have somebody in his corner. He heard a small knock on his door frame. His mother stood there, leaning in with half a smile. "How's our little friend?" she asked. Her eyes glowed with warmth. The tension Ethan once sensed between himself and his mother seemed to have lifted, replaced by a gentle kinship. He smiled at her. "Huh, uh, he's good," Ethan replied. "I think we're both good." She nodded. "Your dad was right. We needed a new perspective around here. Might as well come from a tiny furball, huh?" She laughed softly, and in that laugh, Ethan heard volumes of acceptance and love he'd yearned for. Carefully, he slid out of bed, cradling the sleeping kitten against his chest. He and his mother walked toward the living room together, side by side, a small sign that a new chapter in their family story was being written each day. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ethan swore he could feel the gentle hum of hope vibrating throughout the apartment. A courage to face life's challenges, a bond that could never be erased by the cruelty of careless words or the sting of being different. Because he had experienced firsthand that when one shows kindness, especially to those who are small and need it most, barriers dissolve and connections are born. Even if it was just a boy and his kitten, compassion had offered a chance for healing, for love, and for forging an unbreakable bond. And just like that, Ethan realized there was no gap too wide for a bit of kindness to cross.